Imagine standing in the Oval Office. Outside, two of the world's most advanced fighter jets, F-35s and F-15s, roar across the sky in a flyover. The man watching them isn't the American president. He's a Saudi prince. And in that moment, with those jets screaming overhead, a decades-old military order in the Middle East is being quietly, deliberately, and permanently dismantled. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a step-by-step unraveling of one of the most consequential geopolitical arrangements in modern history. A deal that sent shockwaves through Tel Aviv, alarmed the Pentagon, and may have already changed the balance of power across an entire region that is right now burning. By the time this video ends, you will understand why one handshake in Washington has led directly to missiles raining down on Riyadh, Dubai, and Doha. You will understand why the world's most important waterway is now effectively closed. And you will understand why the head of the International Energy Agency just called this the greatest global energy security challenge in all of recorded history. Stay with this. Because what happened in that Oval Office was just the first domino. For decades, the United States operated under a very specific policy in the Middle East. It was called the Qualitative Military Edge, or QME. And the principle was simple. Israel would always be militarily superior to every country surrounding it. Not just a little superior, significantly, decisively, overwhelmingly superior. This was not a handshake agreement. Congress wrote it into law in 2008. It became the backbone of American military strategy in the region for an entire generation. The crown jewel of that edge? The F-35. Built by Lockheed Martin, the F-35 is not just a fighter jet. It is a flying intelligence network. It combines fifth-generation stealth technology, radar-evading shaping, classified thermal management systems, composite materials that make it nearly invisible to enemy detection, with data fusion capabilities that no other aircraft in the world can match. It can fly at over 200 miles per hour. It can lead swarms of drones into combat. It can gather battlefield intelligence while simultaneously conducting long-range precision strikes. And it can do all of this before the enemy even knows it is in the airspace. Israel was the first country in the Middle East to receive the F-35. They built not one, but two full squadrons. Then they ordered a third. They customized their version, called the F-35I Adir, meaning mighty in Hebrew, integrating Israeli-developed technologies that made it even more formidable than the standard model. In the recent 12-day war against Iran, these jets were at the tip of the spear, slicing through Iranian air defenses like they were paper. No Arab nation had the F-35. No Arab nation was even close to getting it. That was the point. And then Mohammed bin Salman flew to Washington, November 18th, 2025. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, arrives at the White House. Fighter jets fly overhead in a welcome ceremony staged specifically for him. And President Donald Trump, standing beside him, announces something that no one in Tel Aviv expected to hear. But in the corridors of the Israeli Defense Forces, there is no happiness. Within days, the Israeli Air Force submits a formal position paper to the Israeli political leadership. The document, first reported by Ynet, contains a stark and alarming warning. The sale of F-35 fighter jets to Saudi Arabia could erode Israel's air superiority in the region. For the first time in decades, another Middle Eastern country would possess the world's most advanced combat aircraft. The Israeli military was not panicking over fantasy. They were reacting to a structural shift in the regional balance of power that had been decades in the making. The F-35 is not just a weapon. It is embedded in Israel's entire concept of deterrence. It is the reason Israeli military planners can project power across the entire region. It is the reason Iran could not stop the strikes on its nuclear facilities. Giving that aircraft to Saudi Arabia, even a slightly downgraded version, changes every strategic calculation in the Middle East. Now here is where the story gets complicated, because there is a deal within the deal, and most people missed it entirely. The 48 F-35s were not the only thing on the table. They were actually the headline, the visible part of something far larger. Saudi Arabia was simultaneously negotiating a bilateral defense pact with the United States, a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement, and most crucially, implicit movement toward normalization with Israel. Think about what MBS was actually doing. He was using the F-35 as leverage. By accepting the jets, and accepting the conditions that come with them, including significant restrictions on how they would be used, Saudi Arabia was agreeing to curtail its deepening military relationship with China. This was a core American demand. A recent Pentagon intelligence report had warned that selling F-35s to Saudi Arabia could inadvertently give Beijing access to the technology through espionage or Saudi Arabia's security partnership with China. Analysts in Jerusalem began reading the announcement differently. One prominent analyst put it this way: the moment Trump made this announcement, it signaled that behind the scenes there had been enormous advancement. The Saudis had almost certainly made a decision to pull back from their Chinese connections. And that decision, which had massive implications for American strategic competition with China, was what the United States was actually buying with the F-35 offer. As for the jets themselves, the fine print told a different story than Trump's public statements. American officials and defense experts quietly clarified to Reuters that the Saudi F-35s would not be identical to Israel's. They would be less advanced. Saudi Arabia would be limited to 2 squadrons. Israel already had 2 squadrons, and another on order. And it would take at least 7 years for the first Saudi aircraft to even be delivered. 7 years in which Israel would continue to fly, train, and upgrade its existing fleet. Former national security official John Hanna put the risk into careful perspective. He acknowledged that in a Saudi-Iran clash, having Saudi Arabia equipped with F-35s was probably a good thing. But he raised a different concern, one that stays with you. What if something happens to MBS? What if another political upheaval reshapes Saudi Arabia? In that scenario, a fleet of F-35s sitting a few minutes flight time from Israel would become, in his words, deeply problematic. So the deal is real, the jets are coming, and the military order that defined the Middle East for 20 years is shifting. But while analysts were still absorbing what this meant, something far more immediate was already in motion. Because while MBS was in Washington, negotiating the future of Middle Eastern air power, events on the ground were spiraling toward a confrontation that would make the F-35 debate look like a footnote. February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran under the operational name Epic Fury. The strikes target military facilities, command infrastructure, and nuclear sites across the country. And in the opening hours of the operation, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is killed. The decision to strike was made. The consequences were immediate, and they were massive. Iran's response is not a symbolic gesture. It is a total activation of every military and strategic asset the Islamic Republic has spent 40 years building. Ballistic missiles streak toward Israeli cities. Drones saturate the air defense systems of U.S. bases across the Gulf. And then, the move that shakes the entire global economy, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issues a declaration. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. For anyone who does not follow energy markets, let this settle in. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway, at its tightest point just 21 miles wide, that connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea and the open ocean. And through that 21-mile gap flows approximately 20% of all the oil consumed by the human race every single day. Every single day. 1/4 of all seaborne oil trade on the planet passes through this one choke point. The moment it is effectively closed, the global economy does not just feel pain. It begins to hemorrhage. Within hours of Iran's declaration, insurance premiums for ships attempting to transit the strait explode to 6-year highs. Commercial operators, major oil companies, tanker owners, one by one, they begin withdrawing from the corridor. Traffic that normally runs at roughly 100 transits per week plummets to 7. The Strait of Hormuz has become, in the clinical language of shipping analysts, a de facto closure for the global maritime community. And the price of oil responds immediately. Brent crude, which closed on a Friday near $73 a barrel, opens the following Monday between $85 and $90. Within days of the strait closure being formalized on March 4, 2026, it surges past $120 per barrel. For the first time in memory, Qatar Energy, the largest LNG exporter on the planet, declares force majeure on all of its exports. It simply cannot guarantee delivery because ships cannot move. The head of the International Energy Agency looks at the numbers and says something that will be quoted for years. This is the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Not the 1973 oil embargo, not the 1979 Iranian Revolution. This. Now let us follow what Iran is doing beyond the strait. Because the strategic playbook Iran is executing is not just about oil. It is about making every American ally in the region bleed simultaneously. Iran launches drones and ballistic missiles at Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. These are not warning shots. These are deliberate strikes on economic infrastructure, energy facilities, and the military bases that host American forces. The rationale from Tehran is explicit. Every Gulf state that allows the United States to operate from its territory is a co-belligerent, and co-belligerents are legitimate targets. Dubai International Airport, the busiest international airport in the world for international passenger traffic, is struck by a drone incident that ignites a fuel tank fire. Flights are suspended. Thousands of passengers are stranded. The economic impact of shutting down that one airport for even 48 hours sends ripples through global aviation and tourism markets. In Qatar, Iran targets the crown jewel of the Gulf economy, the Ras Laffan LNG facility. This is the single largest concentration of natural gas production infrastructure on the planet. The strike causes extensive damage. Qatar intercepts 2 Iranian Su-24 bombers in the process, the first Iranian aircraft to be shot down by any Gulf state in the conflict. But the damage to Ras Laffan is done. And in Europe, where natural gas storage was already at historically low levels following a harsh winter, at just 30% capacity, the Dutch TTF gas benchmark nearly doubles to over 60 euros per megawatt hour. In Saudi Arabia, Iran targets Riyadh itself. A ballistic missile is intercepted over the capital. Another strikes an uninhabited area. Saudi Arabia's air defense systems are working, but they are being pushed. Every intercept burns through expensive missiles. Every alert forces civilian populations underground. The economic cost of constant military readiness at this level is staggering. And in the UAE, authorities report their air defenses are actively intercepting incoming Iranian fire. The Emirates, which had positioned itself as a hub of global business and finance, a safe haven in a turbulent region, is now sounding missile alerts. The psychological and economic cost of that transformation is incalculable. Iran is simultaneously waging a different kind of war on the water. Sea drones strike oil tankers across the Gulf. A large explosion caused by an underwater drone strikes the oil tanker Sonangol Namibe near Kuwait, more than 800 kilometers from the Strait itself. The conflict is not contained. It is expanding geographically with each passing day. By mid-March, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center has logged more than 16 confirmed attacks on shipping since the start of hostilities. Cruise ships that had been sailing through the Persian Gulf find themselves stranded. At least 6 major cruise ships with 15,000 passengers aboard have nowhere to go. Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company, reroutes entirely through the Suez Canal. Most other commercial operators quietly begin calculating the cost of sailing around the southern tip of Africa, adding weeks and enormous expense to every voyage. And then Iran delivers a warning that changes the calculus for every government in the world. March 23rd, 2026. President Trump, over a weekend, issues an ultimatum. Iran has 48 hours to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, or the United States will obliterate its power plants. The threat is as stark as any made by an American president in decades. Iran's Revolutionary Guard responds immediately. Their statement, read on Iranian state television, is chilling in its specificity. They say, without ambiguity, if Iran's power plants are attacked, Iran will target the power plants of Israel and the power plants of regional countries that supply electricity to American bases. They will also strike economic, industrial, and energy infrastructure in which American companies hold interests. Do not doubt that we will do this, the statement reads. Then, Iran's Defense Council goes even further. It announces that any country deemed non-belligerent may only transit the Strait of Hormuz through direct coordination with the Iranian Navy. And any attack on Iran's coasts or islands will trigger mine laying across Gulf sea lanes, a move that would effectively blockade maritime traffic far beyond the narrow strait itself. The world absorbs this threat and asks a simple question: can they actually do it? And the answer from military analysts is uncomfortable. Yes, Iran has extensive mine warfare capabilities. It has one of the largest inventories of unmanned aerial vehicles in the world. It controls the northern coastline of the strait, and it has demonstrated, repeatedly over the past 4 weeks, the ability to execute coordinated multi-vector attacks across an enormous geographic area. On Monday, Trump announces that the United States will delay the strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure by 5 days while it negotiates. Oil prices immediately fall on the news. But Iran's foreign ministry issues a statement that cuts through the market optimism with surgical precision. There is no dialogue between Tehran and Washington. There are no talks. The temporary pause is unilateral. And the strait remains, in the words of U.S. Central Command Admiral Brad Cooper, physically open, but effectively closed, because Iran continues to fire missiles and drones at any vessel that attempts to transit. A few ships have moved through, mostly those from countries Iran considers friendly or neutral: China, Pakistan, Turkey, India in limited numbers. One ship reportedly paid $2 million to use an Iranian-controlled channel north of Larak Island. The price of passage through a strait that used to be free has become extortionate, and for most of the world, that price is simply unavailable. Let us talk about what this means for the global economy. Because the energy disruption is only the beginning of the economic story being written right now. When the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed, oil stops moving. But it is not just oil. The Gulf countries collectively account for roughly 45% of global sulfur exports, a key industrial input for fertilizers, metal processing, and the chemical industry. They account for 20% of global LNG, natural gas that is critical not just for energy, but for the production of nitrogen fertilizers. The fertilizer supply disruption is not an abstraction. It is a direct threat to global food production because fertilizers grown from natural gas feedstocks feed crops that feed billions of people. The Gulf Cooperation Council, states themselves, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, rely on the Strait for more than 80% of their caloric intake. Their food imports. By mid-March 2026, 70% of the region's food imports are disrupted. Retail chains are airlifting basic staples. Consumer prices for food in Gulf cities have spiked between 40 and 120%. What began as a geopolitical crisis is acquiring the shape of a humanitarian one. Europe is staring down a second energy crisis. Natural gas storage was already critically low going into the spring. The suspension of Qatari LNG and the Strait closure have combined to produce a supply shock that economists are comparing to the energy crisis that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks have nearly doubled. European industrial production is beginning to slow. The continent that spent years diversifying away from Russian energy dependency is now grappling with a new dependency, one it cannot resolve through diplomacy. Asian economies are the most structurally exposed. China receives between 45 and 50% of its total crude oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. India faces similarly acute vulnerability. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, the industrial powerhouses of East Asia, source enormous portions of their energy from Gulf suppliers that can no longer ship through the Strait. India and Pakistan have dispatched naval destroyers to escort tankers in the Gulf of Oman, though not through the Strait itself. The situation has no easy solution. On global stock markets, the impact has been measurable. From early March through mid-March, the S&P 500 fell roughly 4.5%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped over 400 points in a single day. But financial analysts warn that these initial declines may represent only the beginning of the market's adjustment if the conflict continues to drag. The further disruption extends, the more permanent the repricing of global energy, shipping, and insurance costs becomes. A senior energy analyst put the fundamental problem this way. There is no functional substitute for the Strait of Hormuz. Alternative routing through Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline and the UAE's Fujairah pipeline can handle a fraction of normal volumes. The route around the southern tip of Africa adds weeks and massive costs to every voyage. No combination of alternatives, in the near term, can materially offset a sustained disruption. The Strait simply does not have a replacement. It has no bypass. The world's energy infrastructure was built around its existence, and the world's energy infrastructure cannot be rebuilt quickly. The cost of the conflict to the United States alone was estimated at $18 billion by March 19th. The Pentagon has requested an additional $200 billion. Now let us come back to where this story began, because the F-35 deal and the war are not separate events. They are chapters of the same narrative. And he was willing to curtail Saudi Arabia's relationship with China, inch toward normalization with Israel, and pay hundreds of billions of dollars in defense contracts to get there. In exchange, the United States got something it desperately wanted. Saudi Arabia more firmly in the American orbit, less dependent on China, and potentially moving toward the Abraham Accords. The F-35 was not a gift, it was a price. It was payment for a strategic realignment that American foreign policy had been attempting to engineer for years. And Israel, whose military formally objected, whose Air Force submitted its position paper, whose strategic doctrine was built around exclusive ownership of the F-35 in the region, was told to accept it. To trust that the downgraded version the Saudis would receive, delivered in 7 years, would not actually erode the edge that American law guarantees them. To wait and see. Some Israeli analysts made a different argument. If Saudi Arabia joins the Abraham Accords as a result of this deal, if the largest and most influential Arab nation formally recognizes Israel, then Israel gains a strategic benefit that outweighs the tactical concern over the jets. A Saudi Arabia with F-35s that is formally at peace with Israel is, they argued, far less threatening than a Saudi Arabia without F-35s, but drifting toward China and Iran. But there is a darker version of this analysis, and it is the version that the most cautious American strategists cannot stop thinking about. The F-35 is a status symbol. MBS wanted it because it announces, unmistakably, that Saudi Arabia has arrived, that it is a peer of Israel in American eyes, that it belongs to the most exclusive military technology club on the planet. The jets will take 7 years to deliver, but the announcement happened now. And the announcement itself, the signal it sends to every other actor in the region, has consequences that will not wait 7 years to materialize. The Iran conflict demonstrates this with brutal clarity. The reason Iran targeted Gulf states so aggressively is because those states are now perceived as full American partners. The F-35 deal formalized that partnership in a way that no previous arrangement had. It told Tehran, the Gulf is not neutral. The Gulf is armed with American fifth-generation technology. The Gulf is inside the American defense perimeter. And Tehran responded accordingly. And now, as we record this video, the situation remains at a knife's edge. Trump has paused the strike on Iranian power plants for 5 days. The Strait remains effectively closed. Iranian missiles continue to fall on Gulf cities. Gulf states are meeting to discuss whether to move from a defensive to an offensive posture, a decision that could widen the conflict in ways that are very difficult to predict or control. The United Kingdom's Joint War Committee has added waters around Oman to its list of high-risk maritime areas, meaning that Oman's ports, which were supposed to provide an alternative route around the Strait, are now themselves compromised. Iranian drones struck fuel storage at Duqm and Salalah. The bypass is gone. 15,000 cruise ship passengers remain stranded on 6 vessels with nowhere to go. 70% of Gulf food imports are disrupted. The world's fertilizer supply is under pressure. Europe is heading into spring with half-empty gas tanks. Asia is scrambling. The global oil market has experienced its largest supply disruption in modern history. And at the center of it all, controlling the narrow 21-mile choke point that the entire global economy built itself around, stands Iran, a country that has been under sanctions for decades, a country whose economy was already under severe stress, with inflation above 40% and a depreciating currency, a country that just watched its supreme leader killed in the opening hours of an American-Israeli military campaign, and a country that is now, despite all of that, holding the world's energy supply hostage. The question that no one can answer right now, not in Washington, not in Tel Aviv, not in Riyadh, is this: what does Iran want in exchange for reopening the Strait? Because Iran is not closing it out of desperation. It is closing it as leverage. It is demonstrating that even in defeat, even after losing its supreme leader, even after watching its nuclear sites struck, it retains the ability to impose catastrophic costs on the global economy. That is the lesson the past 4 weeks have taught every government on Earth. Military superiority does not translate automatically into strategic control. The most powerful air force in the region can destroy targets with precision. But it cannot easily force open a waterway that is covered by missiles, mines, drones, and an enemy that has decided the cost of holding it is worth paying. And so the F-35 Masterplan, MBS's grand bargain, the deal in the Oval Office, the flyover of the most advanced jets in the world, sits in a different context now. The jets are still coming. The deal is still real. The strategic realignment MBS engineered is still happening. But the region those jets are supposed to defend is already on fire. The military balance is shifting. The economic consequences are already being measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. And the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide, irreplaceable and currently controlled by a country that has nothing left to lose, remains the hinge on which the entire global economy turns. What happens next in those 21 miles will determine the fate of a world that spent decades pretending it had already made itself safe.